Hi, everybody. Welcome. We are here today as part of our Get to Know OCC live Q&A series. We're really excited. Today, we're bringing you Anatomy of a Chronic Illness, the biology of how we get sick. So we're building off Michaela's story from Desperate Patient, Curious Provider. We're actually, Allie and I are going to share some of our personal stories as well to kind of round out like where people are coming in and what's happening with our different symptoms and our different presentations. And then we're going to largely pass things off to Jess, who's going to break down some biology for us and really get into the science in some really fun ways. Fun for us.
I think a lot of people probably don't know, Christine, that, we talked again last session about my experience and how that ultimately created with Jessica what we do here at OCC, but that you are in fact very much a similar patient in many ways, doing really well with the approaches that we use. And Allie, that you found your way to functional medicine for your own reasons and why, and even painting a little bit of how we have interrupted, I hope, the path that you've been on and are hopefully avoiding some of the experiences that Christine and I have had. So,
right.
Yeah. And then also ask us questions, as how we do these things. Please, in the comments. So we have folks both on Facebook and YouTube. We don't think you can see each other's comments, so we're going to try our best to, if you have questions and things, reiterate so everyone's on the same page. But ask us questions as we're going along. We'll weave it in as always. And yeah, we're excited to share. So Michaela's going to kind of guide this part where Allie and I are sharing. So I'll let Michaela kind of set things up.
Yeah, sure. So for first timers, as I said, there's a really detailed account of my history going all the way back into childhood that I think could be really valuable for people. So there's that, but we would love to present two very different backgrounds and how things have developed for you, Allie, and for you, Christine, from those different backgrounds so that we can paint a picture that really captures a pretty wide audience of people and how ultimately different experiences, different genetics can manifest in really similar ways. I think since Allie and I have really similar, we're live. There's animals having a difficulty together right now. So, but I think why don't we start with you, Christine, because it's really, I think it is a different experience from mine and Allie's as far as childhood goes. So yeah, why don't we start with you and what was little Christine doing and feeling?
So like you said, a really different thing is when as a kid, I was not like a sick kid. I mean, I obviously got sick, but it wasn't some narrative that like, oh, Christine's so sickly or Christine's always getting sick. I don't know. I did sort of get tendinitis a couple times. It was maybe weird, but generally I was like a normal kid who sometimes got the flu and stuff like that. And it was really in my 20s that I started having some things that felt a little weird. But really when and that was kind of like some.
Can you say what those things were? Tell us.
Yeah. Chronic yeast thing was probably the biggest, and I was finding my way into things like healthy eating, being a vegetarian, yoga, stuff like that. Not necessarily because I felt ill, but I definitely had anxiety. For sure.
So did you have anxiety in childhood, Christine?
I think I did. My parents would be like, "Yes, Christine, you did." Like I was terrified of going to sleep. Oh, you're muted, Jess, from your.
What was the question that Mick asked you?
Did she have anxiety in childhood?
Oh.
So, like, I felt terrified going to sleep, like every night, kind of thing. Definitely. So I was a kid where like my parents got divorced when I was 3, and I had 2 houses, and I definitely had a kind of like at night, things coming out, and also like a very like our family culture and like the town I grew up in, I was like a very like overly high achieving kind of kid. So like tons of school, tons of activities, exhausted, especially in high school. Like I actually think high school is the most exhausted I've ever been in my life, which is saying a lot. Even like maybe having an infant is like about, but I was like so bone tired like all the time. And then it was really after my daughter was born 12 and a half years ago, that like she was 6 months old and I got shingles like out of nowhere. It's from there stuff started, and I got shingles again, and I started having crazy GI symptoms. And I said, and then it was sort of like this picture of like, what's going on with Christine's health? Like something's awry. And from there, kind of like weird, like felt like I was getting sick all the time, which now looking back, I was having like chronic Epstein-Barr kind of activation because like no one else was ever getting sick. I was like, I always getting all these colds all the time that no one else was even, I had a little kid. Sometimes we'd get that, but she wouldn't be sick and I'd be sick, right? So stuff like that happening, really bad GI stuff. And then that led me on this path where I met Jess in 2018. I think 17 kind of reached out, I think. And was like I was then to this period where it's like I'm going to the family practice like constantly. Throat things, GI GI workup, insanity. Like this is where, and then it starts to be like that, this test, that test, all these scans, all these things, and different medication, and like nothing really working. Periods where I could hardly stomach eating almost anything. And in that, and then coming into working with Jess, getting some and this is where it gets parallel, like some traction on things as we're doing, work on I have SIBO, I have Candida, I have Epstein-Barr, oh, I have Lyme, oh, I have like all these things. And then it's in the last, but then this is where interesting, and this, Mick, that's why I'm smirking. Before OCC, in the transition to OCC starting, there was a webinar with Michaela and Jessica that I attended about MCAS. And my reaction was, oh, that sounds so hard for people who have that. Turns out I like super have MCAS. But it was not, right? So it's like I still wasn't seeing myself because I still had, I think, this self-narrative is like, well, I'm basically a healthy person. I just have these like weird separate things going on. And different periods where I was getting, some traction and some stability, and then a period of more sickness, and then a little bit, and then a period, right? So it was vacillating enough that I really, until recently, didn't identify at all. Like anatomy of a chronic illness, I wouldn't attend this. I did not identify as someone with a chronic illness at all. Even though retrospectively, it's like, hi, Christine, what do you think? What do you think was going on? Like you were chronically ill. You had all these things. So, having to reduce work, having to, just like super impacting my life in that way.
Christine, may I just ask, because I think we're going to dive into this with Allie also, but when especially like what you know now versus how you always thought of your upbringing as being like pretty wonderful. You have wonderful parents overall, and it took a minute for you to even get to like, yeah, I had anxiety. Like you didn't fully identify as somebody having like this, but you're going to bed afraid every night. And like even the pressure of high achieving and like feeling driven in that way that is pushing you to this
and
level.
now I kind of look back and there was a lot of feeling kind of like okay, like what's going on, and
sure,
like that, but a lot
with all the education you've received just about how ubiquitously, like as a culture, the Western culture is not giving infants what they need to, what human infants need to feel safe and to have a regulated autonomic nervous system, which therefore regulates, the neuroregulation of all of our systems. are you able to see how, right, that even the presence of anxiety is a symptom of dysregulation that would have been present?
Right. And I think as part of my own ANS work here with OCC and reflections, there's definitely, and I know we'll sort of touch on this a teeny bit today, but there's definitely some like epigenetic kind of intergenerational stuff on both sides of my family filtering in. There's, sort of our family cultures of certain high achieving and expectation and success. Like I think in a lot of ways, like this, and I say this a lot about my high school experience, which I already mentioned, like I was a very successful student, right? But like at a real personal cost. So I was like doing great by society's standards and yet really not feeling okay, right? So I think like looking back, I can see periods like that. And I had disruption, right? Like my parents got divorced. I had two wonderful, really loving households. And that's still a disruption to like an early kid. That's an event, meaningful event. In terms of autonomic nervous system dysregulation, like at that age, even as well as my parents showed up for me, given that, right? So I think that just so many ways of like what our culture expects of us and what it means to like do well in our culture at the expense of our biology and what our body's really needing. And I think often continually like sacrificing my like basic needs in a lot of ways to achieve, to do well, right? And in a lot of it to be accepted by my friends, because this is what we're in my community and my family, right? Like these expectations for my benefit to succeed and do well, right? So how it all reinforces each other. And
so would it be fair to say just that you, as someone who, right, by all standards, seem to be successful, seem to be relatively healthy, that even when in retrospect, it's quite obvious that you weren't healthy and kind of falling apart in a, by the time that you're meeting Jess, but that, there's lots of people who don't identify as having trauma in their childhood. And what we're beginning to understand is that there's this way that attachment wound trauma, developmental trauma is this like, way that it's creeping into everyone's experience. And people don't necessarily, when they hear that, they are like, oh, that I have wonderful parents. I have a great upbringing, and how that still can play out in what appears to be, not the big T high ACE score childhood.
Exactly.
You weren't chronically sick the whole time, but nevertheless, you arrive at a point where you're really, significantly struggling.
And there was a period when I was in graduate school before my daughter was born. And then that's when after she was born and I'd step back from school and work in a way that my health kind of started, like looking back, I woke up every morning with a super clenched, like acidic stomach and sense of panic. That was just like, felt like my natural drive to get stuff done for the day. And it was almost it was only when it stopped,
right,
that I was like, that's just not called being a person.
Right.
Like
it
was so forever for me that I didn't even know that wasn't supposed to be like what it's like to be a person waking up. Like I almost didn't even notice
that. Jessica, you're going to, maybe you want to say something now.
Yeah, just for 1 second. I just want to reframe what you guys just said in one way, and I'd like to say it in a slightly different way, which is that Christine, the childhood that you're describing, even though very common, not overly traumatic in any kind of big T trauma ways, still was priming your biology to have a dysregulated immune response because of the way that the autonomic nervous system controls what parts of your physiology are operational at any given time. And so I think what we're really hoping to be able to hit home today, and I'm not going to do it yet, we're going to hear from Allie, but I'm just wanting to set up this frame here that what we're wanting to try to convey in a relatively short period of time is how there are predictable patterns, predictable downstream consequences immunologically from different scenarios, different experiences. And so when Michaela and I meet in a discovery call, for instance, with someone who's coming in with a lot of physical challenges, regardless of what they are, what kind of autoimmune disease or toxicity or chronic fatigue or chronic long haul COVID or whatever it is, there is an understandable, predictable pattern of what we're saying, Christine, kind of falling apart, right? There is a predictable pattern in that. And so I hope that that's a gift to people to realize, oh, I didn't just get here randomly. I'm not so unlucky that everything's just falling apart in unpredictable and not understandable ways. The sad thing is not all providers understand that predictable pattern, but we're here to help you understand how it does happen.
So, if I may, was there anything you want to add? Christine, you'll obviously have another opportunity.
I don't think so.
Okay, great.
Thank
so, Allie, going back to little Allie and what's happening for you, to the extent that you feel comfortable sharing, whatever you want to paint a little picture of what your experience was in childhood, and then the ways that you started noticing. And actually, I mean, I think you're similar to me in terms of like being really sick a lot and having difficulty recovering from infection and viral. Yeah, you want to say more about that?
Antibiotics were a part of my childhood.
Mm-hmm.
I want to first say that like it wasn't until very recently, relatively recently in my life, in my 20s, that I did, like you, Christine, have a shift in my thinking. I'm like, oh wow, when I look back on me as a kid, I think I was very happy. I think I had a lot of privilege. I had a lot of fun, for sure. I had a very lax parenting style, which allowed for a lot of freedom, arguably too much freedom. But as a kid, that felt fun, right? And so I enjoyed that. And it wasn't until later that I look back on that and see where there was issues in that. So growing up, yes, I was very sick, but I also had like a very fun childhood in a lot of ways. And so, but to go back to I did have like chronic strep. I had chronic ear infections. I had tubes put in. I had tubes taken out. I had my tonsils and adenoids removed. I had a lot of gastrointestinal issues when I was a child, a lot of food sensitivities. I had cyclic vomiting syndrome, which that was a really big one that I didn't understand until I was exploring my hormonal health in my 20s, which was very messed up. And yeah, so every single year I had this cyclic vomiting syndrome. I was hospitalized 15 or 16 times for that. And I didn't realize until I was older that that was actually caused from adrenal fatigue or adrenal dysregulation. I'm not entirely sure how to name that. Jess, I'm sure you could. But yeah, that was very, very challenging, and it was very odd. And my friends knew about it. It would happen when my friends were over sometimes, and it was definitely something that wasn't normal. And then into my 20s, I had a lot of hormonal issues and was infertile and had adrenal PCOS, and that was a whole thing that I had to work out. But that was also the time where I started having this shift of, oh, like really it was that cyclic vomiting thing that really triggered the like, oh, that stress that I was under as a child from there was alcohol abuse and rehab and divorce when I was 13 and absent parents. I don't want to say necessarily neglectful, but absent. A lot of different babysitters and staying at different people's houses and that kind of thing. So it was like I was being cared for by a host of different people. And in a way, like I say, as a child, I look on that and I'm like, it was fun. I got to hang out with all these different people and stay at my friends' houses all the time. And but yeah, it's not until I look back on it with the lens that I have now that I can see that that actually wasn't as maybe fun as I thought it was. And so I do feel also privileged that I caught this kind of thing in my 20s and soon after that. So I got into I discovered functional medicine after going to all the millions of not millions, but tons of doctors and couldn't get anything worked out. And so I literally just like quit taking all the medicine that I was on. I quit going to any of the doctors that I saw and started really just self-exploring and discovered functional medicine and went into that. And soon after that, discovering OCC, which was a whole other world that I didn't know anything about polyvagal theory. I think I'm kind of weaving here. So Mick, if you want to help me.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit. You find functional medicine and you decide to become a health coach.
Yeah.
Part of that is you're noticing that some of the changes you're making must be helping your health, I would imagine.
Oh, yeah.
That urged you on to wanting to explore that more deeply.
For sure.
Okay.
Yeah. And so, yeah, exactly. I made a lot of dietary changes and some lifestyle changes. I was on Adderall when I was really little. And so I was very like not, and I think that a lot of people say that when you take Adderall, it should calm you down and allow you to focus. But I really enjoyed the like stimulant aspect of it. And so it made me very energetic. And I worked out like crazy, way more than I should have. I used that as like a stress reliever, and was drinking a ton of caffeine. And so I made a lot of changes in that regard. And that I did see a substantial improvement in my health and especially in my skin, and my hormones started to regulate and things like that. And, you know, I tell these guys all the time that like when I first came to you, it was the 5 pillars of health. That's what I was trained on. And those were the things that you do to be healthy. And those were all the things that I was doing. And it was, you know, my relationships were improving. I was noticing I was choosing better people in my life, and that kind of surrounding myself with good people and having healthier movement, not to the same extreme, and healthier diet, and not 8 shots of espresso and 3 cups of coffee every day. It was water and tea. And so anyway, I was doing the 5 things, and then I get to OCC and I learn about polyvagal theory, and my whole framework or my whole mindset of coaching was like, oh, so these are the things, but this needs to happen first. This is autonomic nervous system regulation, which really influences all of those. And so I feel really lucky to be having this opportunity for myself and to learn for others, of course, but to hopefully stop that train from going in that direction, right? And yeah.
May I say, how old are you, Allie? Are you willing to tell us?
I'm 29.
Okay, great. And Christine?
43.
Okay. And I'm 49, as is Jessica. So just would you say, Allie, you, unlike Christine, had some obvious immune-related chronic health things. And I love, Christine, that I don't love at all, but shingles comes up for you as one of the first things. But this is so obviously an immune.
Yeah.
Why am I getting shingles? But
I'm 31.
Right.
Why am I getting shingles?
Right.
I don't have cancer and I don't have, whatever.
Exactly. But Allie, when would you say things like kind of started to, what did it seem just like a progression, or was there actually a point, and how old were you when it felt like things really accelerated or amplified in some way with your health?
Do you mean amplified towards the bad, or things flipped towards the positive?
No, to more accelerated illness, symptoms of illness.
I would say when I was, around 21, 22, was when I kind of reached that, like, I'm sick of all these doctors, nothing's getting better. And yeah, so I was about 22. And then I found functional medicine around 23.
Great. And Christine, for you?
I think I was like 33, 34, 35 when it was like my train really fell off.
Okay.
The cliff, the tracks.
And I was reflecting back on, and again, that's the desperate patient, curious provider, that it was, I had plenty of, like you, Allie, like childhood illness and things, but it really there was this new layer that happened in my early 20s that felt, before the real collapse that happened in my 30s. It was in my early 20s that I really started noticing some really very bizarre immune related things. So just to quickly paint a picture, and then I'm going to pass it off to Jess a little. Jess, fair to say though, Allie, she's describing a lot of fun in her childhood, but also clearly
I did also have a lot of anxiety and depression and panic attacks. I didn't mention that.
Well, and freedom to a kid, this is
Yeah.
universally true. There's freedom and there's aspects to that that are fun, of course, and you're not having restrictions that maybe other kids are having. But the truth is every child feels safest when they are being held in really clear, consistent boundaries. They know what the rules are. People are watching. It feels like love to have people, setting rules, even though love was obviously present in your life and people were caring for you, but a lot of unpredictability, some volatility. Anytime there's addiction, there's volatility. Right. Not having the autonomic nervous system loves consistency, having some kind of routine, predictability. That's how it can rest in safety. So in your case, there's a little more of these big T trauma type things happening. And then we're seeing that, like myself, in your immune history as a child. And then Christine, for you though, even like pressure that you must pass this test to the autonomic nervous system, Jess, is pretty much perceived the same way in terms of how the biology goes, correct?
Exactly.
Okay,
Yeah,
so I want to pass that off, that actually these two very different seeming, one's like potentially capital T, big T trauma. Another one is like, are we calling that a trauma? And yet it's actually driving the same biology that is changing the way our immune system functions and all of these other organ systems.
And that feels like a segue to one of the sentences that we all say regularly at OCC, which is, we know that your body knows how to heal and it wants to heal. So in other words, if you're coming to us or any other provider with a level of illness that is like, hey, something keeps happening, whether it's the same thing or different things that seem totally unrelated, something's going on here, something's weird. What I fall back on, and what we at OCC fall back on is, hey, if your body had the capacity to heal, if you had the neuroregulation to allow that which your body knows how to do, which is heal, if that could be happening, it would be happening. And so almost truly by definition, by the fact of anyone seeking my services, because I happen to have for, I don't know, 7-8 years now been a functional medicine provider. So the people who are seeking my particular services over the last 7 or 8 years are people whose bodies are not healing to the level that the body wants to be healing at. And so by definition, I can infer that there are blocks in the healing pathway. And when you learn, as Ali is describing, this kind of like, whoa, aha moment of learning polyvagal theory and learning the implications of this concept of what functions in your body are receiving instructions and energy to run. And when you realize polyvagal theory and the truth of this, where when the nervous system decides for whatever, it's looking all around, it's looking inside your body for messages, cues of safety or danger, it's looking in your environment, the sounds, the chemicals in the air, the smells, the tastes, do you taste something rotten? It's looking for temperature cues, barometric cues, etc. UV cues. I mean, it's looking at all the different things in your environment, and it's also at an equal level looking at, between you and other mammals, especially other humans, what are the cues coming from their nervous systems? Because it turns out that all of our nervous systems are always both giving out and receiving cues, either of safety or of danger. And that's not something we have much control over. We are, even when we think we're kind of faking it, our nervous systems are actually sending out messages of what the nervous system says if you're safe or in danger. And so this is all fascinating information and fascinating facts.
Can I ask you to explain briefly why, as mammals, why our autonomic nervous system, which is really only concerned with survival functions, it is mainly guided toward making sure that, it is that lever that is it turns on or off our capacity for healing and all of that healthy physiologic function. And so at the root of that is like survival. Why, if it's concerned with promoting survival, is it looking for safety between us and other mammals, especially humans?
Because as mammals, having evolved, mammals are pretty progressed in evolution in the animal kingdom. And mammals have a part of our autonomic nervous system called the ventral vagus, involving the social engagement system. And for mammals who rely on care of older ones of their own species, so in our case, parents or some type of adult caregiver, when we are infants, we cannot survive without the care of other members of our species. And therefore, mammals with ventral vagus, fibers, the nervous system prioritizes relational safety. Do I fit into my tribe? Am I cared for? Am I accepted? Am I loved? Do I have what I need, in connection with other humans? That is prioritized at the same level as physical safety. So I think that we culturally very much think of safety in terms of, are you safe from gun violence? Are you safe? Do you have heat? Do you have clothing? Do you have food, safe food, water? And all of that is, of course, of the utmost importance, but it is the same level of importance as having safety communicated by the social engagement system of another human to you in your infancy. And that is something we just don't know culturally.
No, we don't. Is that true in adulthood? I can order Grubhub and get food and, delivered right to me. Do I need my tribe as an adult, Jessica?
You need your tribe as an adult. We need connection. There's a lot of good science people and functional medicine people and kind of neuroscience people nowadays really sharing this information widely, I think, which is a gift. So hopefully, the next couple generations down the line are going to grow up knowing how important it is to have human interaction. We all have lived through the pandemic, the acute part of the pandemic, where there was so much isolation. And I think we all know that, especially in our country, at least, I don't really know about other countries, but in our country, the teens suffered with their mental health terribly, a lot more suicide, a lot more depression and anxiety. And, it's multifaceted, but the bottom line is the science is very strong. We need human connection to be healthy. And really, that's not actually disputable anymore. I can't really cite the papers at this moment, but that is a truth. All through life, we need human connection.
And actually, I will just say that the studies are really unequivocal about this. When Jess and I before we even opened, we went digging into this is science that has been known for decades and unfortunately has not made it to the fore. Thankfully, it is just beginning to now. So we're really proud to be able to bring this science out to the masses. But the truth of it is that just to help paint the picture, life has evolved, our culture has evolved, all of these things have evolved way faster than our biology has evolved. It has not evolved very much from a time where we really did literally depend on one another to survive, that we needed the care of the tribe if we were sick, injured, to share responsibilities, all of that. And so that is the biology that we have. And I think it also relates, Jess, if you want to at some point talk about how just we're assaulted with all sorts of things that are, outside of relational toxins, chemicals, 5G, news, just being inundated with threatening things, in media, all sorts of things that are actually signaling threat and overwhelming our system in ways that our biology has not yet evolved to be able to deal with.
Right. We are living in a time, unfortunately, where there are lots of perceived threats by our autonomic nervous system, relationally in almost every household, because the ways that, I, as a healthcare practitioner that took care of kids, told parents what I had been taught, the best way to raise your child is, get them on a schedule with sleep, and don't worry, if you let them cry long enough, they will fall asleep, and it'll only last 3 nights, and they'll be okay and everything. But not knowing that actually what our autonomic nervous systems evolved to anticipate and to need for the cues of safety relationally is not to be deserted when you're having needs, crying, screaming. And so, I mean, just to say, like, Michaela and I, and no doubt the rest of us who have kids, Christine, not Allie yet, but Michaela and I, we have adult children, and we know that we contributed to their autonomic dysregulation, not because we didn't love them, not because we didn't do the very best that we knew how at the time, but because we didn't know how. We didn't have regulated autonomic nervous systems ourselves, number one. So we actually couldn't have provided that regulation level that would have been optimal. But also, just whatever. We didn't do everything perfectly. Who can? Who does everything perfectly? Nobody. And that is a hard pill to swallow. It is also where we're at. And so, like, we know that the very best thing we can do for our kids who receive dysregulation from us is to get ourselves regulated, to learn this information for ourselves, apply it to ourselves, and then provide that regulated, other to our kids. And, so anyway.
Well, and I think it's worth mentioning that we were just talking about this earlier, that it's the generation of children, like our children's generation, we are seeing more illness,
Earlier.
more strange earlier, autoimmunity, allergic type phenomena, GI trouble, depression and anxiety, all sorts of what we're calling mental health or behavioral health type issues that are actually likely driven by neuroinflammation or some other kind of processes that are in the body, in addition to the ways that those things would necessarily come up in response to what we're describing as this biological need we have for this very specific kind of relational safety delivered in our early development. And so part of what we can do is, polyvagal theory has only been recently described, really, that we're just coming into this critical knowledge of how, this is when we teach our class, helping people to understand their own experiences through this lens is so helpful. So,
and I know a narrative that I feel like in my peers and a lot of an understanding is like, we are seeing our kids so much sicker.
Yep.
And it feels like, well, we're just living in such a sick world. There's so many toxins, microplastics everywhere. We're drinking water that's polluted. We're breathing air that's polluted. We're eating food that's polluted. So, Jess, I'd love if you
can minerals, stripped of its nutrients, right?
Or we're exposed to heavy metals, or there's just so much going on. And Jess, I've heard you describe like this image of the cabbage and sort of bringing in how polyvagal theory and this work that you're bringing to functional medicine, like, because that is all true. And
right.
So if you could kind of
I personally love the image of the cabbage, because I hear a lot of times, and even in other integrative practitioners, I hear things about the layers of the onion, right? So it's like, okay, we've tested you and you have mold toxicity, so now we're going to treat you for mold toxicity. But you're still sick. So they describe that they've peeled one layer of the onion, which was mold, and now they're at the next layer, and it's time to find out what that is and then treat that. And I much prefer the image of the cabbage, because our bodies and our ability to get well and our sicknesses, etc., are not layer. It's not that you can get rid of one and then you can get rid of another and then you can get rid of another and finally achieve health. It's really that these layers are just so intertwined. When you peel, you can touch a piece of a cabbage leaf, but to get to that cabbage leaf, you might have to have taken back 4 others to actually be able to get that leaf available to you. And that is really much more, it's still not a perfect analogy, but it's much more the way that our physiology is layered. And so I'm going to dive into that a little bit. I would like to go back to what I was saying about how your body knows how to heal and it wants to heal. And by definition, if you're seeking alternative type care other than just strict prevention, if you're seeking it because you feel that some of the things that you're experiencing physiologically don't make sense in the conventional model of, one pathogen, one treatment, get well, done, period, then that itself is evidence of autonomic dysregulation. In other words, what I mean by that is not any particular insult in your autonomic, safety. I don't know that there's one thing or 20 things that have assaulted your autonomic nervous system's capacity to feel safe. But what I do know is that your autonomic nervous system has prioritized survival strategies physiologically over the health, growth, and restoration functions, which include good digestion, good assimilation of the nutrients that you're taking in, good detoxification of your blood and lymph and all of that. So elimination, in other words, healthy elimination of all the junk waste products, both biological waste products like old hormones and also, mold toxins that you've taken in from your peanut butter or, whatever, heavy metals that you got in your water or, chemicals that were in your foods. Whatever the things, your body does know how to detoxify. And I just want to say as a caveat, there are genetic SNPs or single nucleotide polymorphisms that people can have that make it harder to do those things. But those SNPs have been around for millennia, guys. Healthy people have those SNPs, and those SNPs are not what's making us unwell. What's making us unwell is this confluence of a whole bunch of things that does include, in every one of these cases, autonomic dysregulation. In other words, the autonomic nervous system perceiving, for some variety of reasons, not enough safety to prioritize those health, growth, and restoration functions, and rather prioritizing, Ali mentioned adrenal, but you guys probably all know, you've all heard of the stress response. Adrenaline, cortisol, we all know that feeling of adrenaline coursing through us when a child or a friend stepped out off the curb and you saw the vehicle coming, and you have adrenaline coursing through you as you grab them and throw them backward. And so yes, that is hormones of the stress response. That's appropriate. In the case of you're about to get hit by a car, totally appropriate. And what's appropriate next? You didn't get hit by the car, yay. So those hormones should settle down and you should go back to having all the normal functions of life, health, growth, and restoration. In Christine's description of her childhood and Ali having cyclic vomiting syndrome, and probably all of us can relate to this on some level, is like, whoa, that stress response isn't calming down always, right? Maybe only once in a while it's calming down. You hope it's calming down while you're sleeping, but not always.
Or it's calming down relative to being way up here, but has not resolved to a point that we would call it the ventral vagal place of being able to feel safe and connected enough to restore that healthy ability to repair and detoxify and digest and all of that.
Exactly. And so there are immune processes that we call pro-inflammatory. And I think everybody these days has heard of inflammation. And I just want to make a quick distinguishment. Is that a word? I want to distinguish quickly between inflammation, which is a completely necessary life-saving process that your immune system knows how to go ahead and send out all these chemical cytokines and communicate and call in different immune responses depending on if you've got a pathogen invading, you need to fight COVID or you need to fight strep or whatever, or if you have an injury and you need to heal from a sprained ankle or a cut or whatever. Those are all totally appropriate, short-term, necessary, life-saving inflammation processes. Those are supposed to go up, solve the problem, resolve, which is not a passive process. It does actually take energy and chemistry, substances, molecules of resolution, but that is supposed to happen, and then go back to like happy immune processes waiting. So always surveying, always being ready to respond to those such types of assaults on your system. But chronic inflammation is what occurs when that inflammation response goes up and cannot, for whatever reason, be completely resolved and kind of go back to that like neutral surveillance. Okay, now we're in a healthy set point waiting, but rather keeps mounting. And so you
may I just, that there's actually two things that are likely going on for a lot of people, which is that there are many things that are causing the inflammatory response, which is, I think, what most people think is happening when the term chronic inflammation is being said. They're thinking there's so many reasons, which is true. But what you're saying,
there's a level of truth to that, but that really is not actually what defines chronic inflammation. Is actually not the new assaults or various assaults, but rather the ongoing process of the inflammatory cycle not being able to resolve, and it actually ends up spreading. Like a cell that cannot be resolved properly gets injurious to the neighboring cells, which then have their own need for an immune response to get cleaned up and fixed up. And if you already had run out of resolution phase chemistry, as it were, the molecules to resolve that initial inflammation issue because of the bajillion inflammatory assaults that the person received, right? Like that's why we're running out. And also because our diets are often very much lacking in the long chain fatty acids that are really only available in cold water fish and algae, those EPA and DHA molecules that are just really critical in the resolution of inflammation. And a lot of people either don't like fish or don't have access to good healthy fish, wild caught. Of course they don't. I mean, our culture has changed food so dramatically that we're not actually tending to eat things that grew up as they were naturally supposed to grow up, just as we don't grow up as we're naturally supposed to grow up, unfortunately. So at this point,
inflammation is inflammation that cannot resolve, and that then turns into its own like problem that becomes more global. And I think there's a term that it's called, has the word necrosis in it. Go ahead. What is it?
Secondary necrosis.
Secondary necrosis.
The way that a cell gets dealt with, in the way that your biology has a cell kind of fall apart when it needs to be recycled, when it's damaged or it's infected and it needs to be taken care of so that it's not a problem in your body. There's a way it's supposed to be taken care of that's more healthy and kind of an organized process, apoptosis or apoptosis. And if that can't happen because of this lack of resolution phase chemistry or whatever reason it can't happen, then it undergoes secondary necrosis and kind of has this almost explosion experience where then the internal components of the cell damage the cells nearby and call in really a big immune response. Like, whoa, there's body tissue damage now. This is a larger type of communicated threat. As the nervous system receives it, when cell components, when self tissue is detected by the lymph system as part of what is floating around because these cells have exploded in the secondary necrosis manner, that is a 5-alarm fire type of message to your system, biologically speaking.
Which is in turn a signal of threat that the autonomic nervous system picks up and is then sending out the messages that there is the survival
need.
So let's say someone had the most perfect upbringing and they feel relationally safe in all of their relationships, secure attachment. That is not the issue, but they have, because of the foods and the absence of nutrients and the chemicals and all of these different things, they're not getting adequate nutrition. So we are now in a chronic inflammation situation, and that the resolution of inflammation can't happen. that 5-alarm fire that you're describing is creating the autonomic dysregulation ultimately, especially if it becomes chronic, then necessarily that is what is happening. Okay. Yeah. Because within. Yeah. So I do just want to say, Jessica has a Foundations of Health class that really walks people through all of this biology, and it's fascinating. And it really is so helpful. I don't think a lot of people understand that resolution of inflammation isn't just like an exercise bike that you get off and the momentum eventually comes to a stop, that there's actually something very active that needs to happen in the body, including certain compounds and things that need, as far as nutrients, that need to be present in the body in order to be able to achieve that. So people who are stuck in a chronic inflammatory experiencing, right, all sorts of symptoms,
which can be so many different symptoms or disease, even separate diseases that people might have been diagnosed with.
Right. Absolutely. And just to say, like, you know, even in Western medicine, they have finally gotten on the bandwagon that, you know, they keep proving one disease at a time that it's caused by chronic inflammation as the underlying cause. And you know, they haven't proven every single disease separately yet, but that's the case. Disease states as diagnosable in our medical culture are caused by the lack of capacity to heal, which means that there's a chronic inflammatory state going on, you know, by definition. So, and now here's kind of the link here. An autonomic nervous system that is perceiving, or neuroceiving, I like better because it's not within your perception. You have no control over.
Right. This is all below any conscious awareness, all of this.
So we'll translate Dr. Porges's term of neuroception into a verb of neuroceive. So when the autonomic nervous system is neuroceiving threat or danger more often than is kind of quote unquote necessary for survival in this moment, that is by definition dysregulation. In other words, you're having survival strategies prioritized in the body more of the time than is probably serving you optimally at this time in your health. And you don't have direct control over that. So if you're sick in whatever way that means, and I don't just mean one viral illness that you get over normally, I mean if you're having something that is coming up, as I described, either various things coming up one after another that may not even seem related, but you're just thinking, how can I be this unlucky? Or you have something like Christine described, like her throat just got nasty and with pus and pain and swollen over and over and over and over, kind of no matter what got done. Either of those types of scenarios say you're spending more time in survival strategies than you are in health, growth, and restoration. And we've got to start peeling cabbage leaves enough to figure out, you know, what are the confluence of things? How can we put out enough fires? How can we bring in enough resolution phase molecules to allow your system to get a hold on some of that, so that we can, you know, Michaela likes to describe a glass of water with mud in it. And when you arrive, it's so stirred up that it's just mud and we don't know what the heck all is in there. But we like to leverage this autonomic nervous system dysregulation that is present in all of these folks that are showing up at a certain place in health, so that it's like you get the bulk of that sediment to settle down in the glass. And now what you've got left swirling around is maybe there is mold toxicity. Maybe there is a heavy metal toxicity. Maybe there is a chronic viral illness or whatever that we can then go ahead and directly address more specifically with our interventions. That which is we don't like to separate. It's all functional medicine. Polyvagal theory is the biology of your body's functioning. So it is functional medicine. But for language purposes, because our language kind of fails us here, we say, the functional medicine interventions are things like detoxification intentionally, or going after a chronic virus intentionally. And then we say autonomic nervous system or neuroscience interventions are where we're working on regulating the autonomic nervous system so that you get more access to the health, growth, and restoration functions. You've got to do both, because we say all the time, people have gone to a bajillion great alternative providers and not found the health that they've been looking for, and even the health that those providers have been able to bring about for other people. Again, by definition, that means that there's autonomic dysregulation in the way of getting that healing to the level that you need it and want it and deserve it. And so that's how we can kind of make these, they're not blanket statements, but that's how we can surely say to you with confidence, my goodness, we can see that there's autonomic dysregulation. We don't know why. We don't have to
doesn't
know
matter why even really. It only matters if it helps you to give some context for understanding what's happening to you, but it doesn't matter why. May I take 2 minutes to just, Christine, because I think this is really important, because the truth of it is, whether you have mast cell activation syndrome or you're in this pro-inflammatory, which by the way, inflammation necessarily means immune function, right? These two are, that's what inflammation is. It's an immune response, right, to perceived threat. In both autonomic nervous system dysregulation and mast cell activation, and or any dysregulation of the immune system, and however that is showing up for you, what it necessarily means is that there has been too much. These are both systems that are designed to protect you. They're first responders in terms of keeping you safe. The mast cells are the most primitive immune cell. They are the first responders. Before anything else has happened, the mast cells will dump all of their 1,000+ inflammatory mediators into the system. It's kind of got a little of everything just in case to try and help. But that happens and becomes chronic because there's been too much that the system has had to deal with, that it can no longer accurately perceive that which is benign and that which is a threat. So it starts reacting to broccoli and a carrot, which is totally benign, and you start having allergic type phenomena or whatever, like ways that you're responding, GI distress, because there's intestinal permeability. And so a piece of that carrot is now the immune system has to attack it, right? These are I want just for you to quickly say before we finish that why this is like a predictable path toward autoimmunity. But I just want to say that mast cell activation, whether you have the mutation that means that you have the syndrome, or you're just in a state where there is so much to respond to that the mast cells no longer can perceive accurately threat and safety. Likewise, the autonomic nervous system, for whatever reason, including all of the things that we have listed that are more environmental and straightforward, that no matter what, it's a system that no longer can accurately perceive its level of safety or threat, and is therefore reacting to everything as if it is a major emergency on a chronic basis. And to further complicate matters, as the cabbage, they are totally interrelated. When we have a stress response because we are running late to an appointment, it will cause the mast cells to degranulate all of those mediators just in case. They're inflammatory. So you can see how tricky this begins and how quickly this can escalate, and how I do just want to say that by the time someone like Christine is like caught in this place, that the system has perceived the lack of safety for a very, 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 very long time. Everyone that comes to us has had some period where maybe stuff was going on, but like then it plummets.
I think it's worth adding that a key catalyst for me was the results of the 2016 election and my personal, I literally felt terror every day and was mobile. And then that's really what sent my health. It's just in terms of like, that was a relational threat in addition to everything else. that then my whole system just sort of
Yeah.
collapsed under.
And just to say that whether it's something like that and it is relational, or it's a surgery or a big traumatic event or a huge loss or a car accident or whatever, we see that often, that it's like, and then there's some big event that actually just like, okay. And for a lot of our people, it was the pandemic. And from a polyvagal perspective, that makes perfect sense. There's so much fear. None of us knew what was going on or what to expect. People were dying. We didn't understand the illness at all or how to treat it. We had to be separate. We were covered. This social engagement system that Jess was describing, how we communicate welcome or warning in that way, we all of a sudden were protected from seeing it from other people, and we weren't able to be close. We couldn't attend funerals or be with people in the hospital. I mean, from a polyvagal perspective, it makes sense that everyone's immune system was actually, it's an unintended consequence of trying to keep us safe. And that's actually the definition of mast cell activation, an unintended consequence of trying to keep us safe. Likewise, ANS dysregulation, an unintended consequence of a system that's just trying to keep us safe. And those healthy functions can be restored in both. So just
let me just real quick just say that, and this is kind of like immunology stuff that I don't ever expect anybody to learn or hang on to the details of, but just to say that the chemistry, literally the chemicals that are let out of mast cells, and as Michaela mentioned, we believe that there are 1,000 or maybe even more chemicals inside mast cells that get released into the bloodstream and then go have their influence elsewhere. Many of them are pro-inflammatory mediators. So that chemistry releasing over and over and over, part of it instructs our what's called T helper cells, which are immature, fighters of sorts, to mature in one way or another. And when our
you want me to share the slide?
Sure, you can.
Look, a slide.
So when our mast cells are letting out this chemistry, we are more going to go toward this T helper 2 maturation. T helper 1 cells fight infection, bacteria, virus. T helper 2 is more allergic type phenomena. Now, not everybody with activated mast cells are experiencing allergies. That is true. There are lots of other mediators that can lead to other types of more dominant presenting symptoms with mast cell activation. But the chemistry behind the scenes is still creating this T helper 2 dominance, which then, when that chemistry has been out and about long term, leads down toward T helper 17 dominance, which is an autoimmune pattern. And so when I hear somebody presenting with an autoimmune disease already having been diagnosed, or no autoimmune disease being diagnosed, but kind of precursors like eczema and fibromyalgia, this type of thing, or they've got a positive ANA, but no actual diagnosis yet from a rheumatologist of an autoimmune disease, I know that this chemistry behind the scenes is happening where there's T helper 2 dominance leading on to T helper 17 activation. We don't want this to continue. We want to re-regulate your immune system so that you can get back to competent fighting of viral and bacterial infections, so that you're not chronically sick from a Lyme infection exposure when you got a tick bite, which everybody in our neck of the woods in Massachusetts, we encounter ticks all the time. They're so tiny, they bite you, they attach, they expose you to their pathogens, and they fall off, and we never even know it, okay? Lots of people don't get chronically sick from that, and some people do. And I know that behind the scenes, and again, you don't have to know this, but I know behind the scenes, if you've got a chronic Lyme situation that isn't resolving from the typical interventions, it means you don't have great T helper 1 function by definition. And it means that you have had more of this T helper 2, which can lead toward T helper 17. And we don't want that. We do not want that. Also, likewise, on the bottom of this slide here, the T regulatory cells, we want lots of Tregs. Those are what tells your immune system, just ignore it. It's fine. That's just good food. That's just pollen. That's just, whatever it is. We don't care. That's just dust. Don't worry about it. I say, don't get your panties in a bunch, immune system. We want that. But if you're maturing the naive T helper cell down the other pathways, you're not making Treg cells.
Yeah.
Right.
And so when you have activated mast cells, for whatever the combination of reasons are, whether it's lack of relational safety and the autonomic nervous system creating that corticotropin releasing hormone from your hypothalamus, activating your mast cells, or it's because you lived in a moldy basement, either of those activate the mast cells. And then you go down this predictable pathway of immune patterns, immune dominance.
So autoimmunity is not random. It's not like luck of the draw. It's not any of that. And so I think one of the most common things that people are experiencing is like, I'm having tons of allergic reactions. Testing isn't consistent. I seem to be positive for this, but I'm not. Yeah, right. I'm actually reacting to all of these other foods and other environmental things that are not showing up on tests, right? You're saying get involved now to interrupt this predictable pathway.
Yes, exactly. That because we understand this chemistry behind the scenes, we know that we can go ahead and leverage autonomic regulation as one thing to really help diminish this pattern, this flow down toward autoimmunity that is an inevitable, predictable process, so that we don't go there. And that's what we hope for Allie when we talked at the beginning about, hey, luckily Allie's young and she found functional medicine early. And, now understanding the ANS component and bringing regulation on board at a young age, that I believe is going to prevent Allie from developing autoimmunity in her 40s or 50s.
Yeah. My dad developed it in his 40s, and that's always been something, or it was something that I thought I was kind of destined for.
My mom has autoimmune, developed in her 50s.
Well, and I have celiac, which is actually an autoimmune disease, and rheumatoid. So I do just want to mention there are so many variables that could contribute to this situation, and we don't need to understand them all. But just to add one more, which is that we know that epigenetic changes from trauma actually exist 14 generations. That's really significant. So it doesn't even have to be simply from our own direct biography. It's our biology and our history, our ancestry that is also that each experience in the womb is passed on. There's some really, really, my mom said, great job, guys. This is actually passed on generation to generation. And this is another reason there are many, again, there's so many different variables to why we're having this moment where our generation, our kids in particular, are so vulnerable right now. It's like, because this is getting passed down generationally, that's another component for why this is happening. Because many of us are evolving in terms of our parenting and the things we're learning, and that we're actually doing we're healing in all of these certain ways, right? And yet our kids are even more vulnerable, right? So I think there's just a lot of things, and we don't need to understand all of the whys. I think it can be helpful, again, to have some context. But what we know is that we can come in here and we can resolve it, whether we know exactly where it happened. And
there's huge opportunity. I think, I'm listening with one ear, imagining something like, this almost feels overwhelming. Like you're naming so many things and ancestry and right. And it's like, and there's a lot, and that's why so many of us are so sick, and our kids are so sick. And there's a huge opportunity for healing. And that's what we've built our approach around. And the next time we get together like this with one of these live streams, we're going to really paint the picture for you of how and why. So starting with autonomic nervous system regulation, what are you even talking about? What does that mean? What are we doing? How can you do that? You said it's like below your awareness, I don't even understand. So we're going to get into what we do, how we take advantage of all of these opportunities to bring about the capacity for healing and repair that your body knows how to do, that your body wants to do.
And why this is different than other things you may have tried, because I think there are
Yes,
a lot of
yes.
folks out there who are like, I've been doing yoga and I've been meditating and I've been like working on lowering my stress levels, and why, like, really getting in here with neuroplastic change in the autonomic nervous system and the process that we take people through, and why we do it for the length of time that we do it, and
Yeah.
how we do it is really a huge part of, you know, again, we'll explain that in a lot of detail, but I think there's a lot of people.
And how those are some great tools, but why, as I can attest to myself, and I know Michaela, you too, it's like, but those practices didn't bring about the healing that we do now experience, right? So what's going on there, and understanding the biology of that in terms of, and then how we're leveraging that knowledge and information. So that will be in 2 weeks. We'll be sharing our components of care here, and what we do and why we do it, from this biological perspective that we've painted here today.
I think the last thing I just want to share is from Dr. Porges. When we were at the PVI conference back in November, he really helped to paint the picture of how neuroregulation of the organs is what is necessary for real healing to take place, and that he's hoping that it becomes common knowledge in healthcare that that's the underlying root cause, no matter how it's presenting, what system it's presenting in. He described a process that if you try to approach it on the surface level, yes, you can try to approach blood sugar and get your diabetes under control, or your hormones and your thyroid. You can look at that. You can look at your gut, but it will be medical whack-a-mole where it will just appear somewhere else. Even chronic pain, if it's migrating, it is going to appear somewhere else until that neuroregulation of the organs happens. And what does that mean? That means autonomic nervous system regulation, a system that perceives enough safety to allow for healthy physiologic function to happen.
Thank you, Michaela. And thank you, everyone, for joining us live here today. If you're here or if you're watching this later, we're so glad you took the time out to be with us, and to be a part of this conversation. We felt you all here with us. We know we were.
Thank you, Christine and Ali, for sharing a bit about your history. And and it's I think really encouraging for our members to get to see that there is, like, health is restored. This is not just my story, but health is restored. And Jess, your brilliance and your, as always, really sensitive, attuned ear, and you're an amazing diagnostician that is just getting better and better all the time. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.